Hello everyone, and welcome to Kembali 2020, Kembali 2020, a Rebuild Bali Festival, a digital platform designed to inspire, excite, reconnect, and revitalize the Balinese and Indonesian community from the 29th of October to the 8th of November 2020. Kembali, the Indonesian word for return or come back, represents revitalization in the face of global challenges. The festival will unite people in Bali and Indonesia together with an international audience at a time when travel is largely impossible and creating connections is more important than ever before. My name is Michael Vatikiotis, and I am a familiar face at the Ubud Festival in normal times, and therefore I'm here with you virtually. And the title of this event is a very, very welcome opportunity to speak with Simon Winchester, who has just written a new book called Land and How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the World. An imposing title to a very, very interesting subject. Simon, I very much enjoyed your book, I'll say that up front, and it prompts so many questions. I feel that we may be consumed by the number of them. So I'd like to start by at the beginning really, and what struck me in the very opening pages of your book was when there are a series of statements throughout the book that are just arresting. And the one that really arrested me perhaps more than anything else was right at the beginning, where you say that cartography is older than agriculture. Explain.
Extraordinary, really. People that owned land, and of course the whole business of owning is something that's fundamental to this book. What does it mean to actually own land? Can any human being own land? He or she needed always to know where its boundaries were, where it began, where it ended. And I sort of come up with this idea, it was not entirely mine, but that in southern England, say, early Bronze Age farmers who were using primitive plows to create furrows in which to plant seeds would, in the case of, let's say, farmer A, do them in a north-south direction, farmer B in a northeast-southwest direction, and when the lines intersected, that was de facto a border between these two pieces of land, which someone had to note down on some kind of a map. And so in order for farmer A to sort of feel comfortable planting his seeds where he did, and farmer B to do the reverse, you needed to know where the land began and ended. And so cartography, effectively, the delineation of land, began before anyone really seriously thought about organized farming. Obviously, farmers irritated the soil and irrigated it then and put seeds which grew, but organized agriculture required you to know the boundaries of the land you were practicing in. And so cartography is the older of the disciplines.
And what do you think, to your knowledge, was the oldest map in the world?
Well, I mean, the famous one is Ptolemy, isn't it? The great T-shaped indication of Northern Europe and Africa, which is tremendously old. I often wonder where the first international frontier was in the world. I mean, I'm sure you have thoughts about this too. If you think of the early civilizations like, penicillin growing outward, or an ink blot on blotting paper, if we remember what blotting paper was, of course, you have the Nile, and you have Mesopotamia, and then you have the Indus civilization, and then you have the Chinese, each of them spreading outwards. So when did the, quote, Egyptians first meet the people that lived in Mesopotamia? And I sort of think to myself that where the Iran-Iraq war was fought down in the delta of the Tigris or the Euphrates was probably where the first obviously different sets of people found out and met each other and were curious. And who are you? You look different from us. You're linguistically very different. You're physically very different. Well, we're not sure that we like you. we're not sure that we trust you, we'll have to put up a fence. And that fence near the town of Susangerd, near Basra, is probably the first border in the world. It's a fascinating topic, and I think it's one that fascinates you too as a geographer.
And we're fellow geographers. We should admit that we both studied the same subject at more or less the same place at different times. And I have to say that one of the things that inspired me when I read your book was the feeling that actually, you know, what a wonderful discipline geography is. And I know that you specialized in particular in geology, which I hated, by the way. I was a human geographer, not the stones, the humans. But, you know, I mean, rivers, I guess, rivers and physical features were perhaps the first boundaries. And your point about the Nile and the Euphrates, you know, I think is a very good one. These are ancient civilizations, ancient peoples. Of course, what didn't separate them in a way was large expanses of featureless desert. And so, you know, they would have come across either escarpments, you know, pieces of rock, or rivers and deltas. I mean, it's interesting on the Suez Canal, which was later built in the 19th century, as you know, but there were these pharaonic projects in that isthmus. It was almost something that was crying out to be done, because it was a very narrow isthmus that people crossed before the canal was built. But it was a great nexus of trade. And of course, one of the points I suppose about land is that it's not just what the land was used for. It was what land was also a feature that people crossed or people used to connect. And the idea that I wanted to raise with you, because it's sort of not covered, at least that it's going even back before cartography. This idea, and I was thinking as I was reading the book, was the basic animal instinct of territoriality. You know, we know that there are birds and there are animals that create elaborate rituals to mark out territory. And I wondered what your thought was about how, you know, whether even before we get to cartography and agriculture, when you talk about the hunter-gatherers, I mean, what would they have thought about a sense of territoriality? Was it only where they lived and where they slept, or was there a larger sense of it, do you think?
Well, that goes to the innate sense in humankind, early humankind, of curiosity and exploration. Yes, they were comfortable to a certain degree in, let us say, Olduvai in Eastern Africa, but a number of them looked at a mountain range that hemmed them in and gave them, if you like, territorial comfort, and thought, I wonder what's on the other side. And that tendency of people to say, I wonder what's on the other side, and maybe they discovered people on the other side with whom they might have traded or gone to war or proselytized if they were seized by some particular religion. I mean, I think of I wrote a book some years ago about the Atlantic Ocean, this extraordinary trek, which took hundreds of thousands of years from East Africa down through the savannas of Central Africa and the jungles, and then you get into what is now South Africa, and then you suddenly come to a cliff, and beyond it is there this great heaving entity of something you've never seen before, which is an ocean, which you manifestly cannot cross. You can't go any further. And you go down to the seashore, and you find, instead of the elephants and giraffes and so forth that you've been chasing and hunting and hopefully feeding off, you find jellyfish, you find oysters, and you find a cave, and you settle down in the cave, and there is such a cave. I'm not making this, it's not a total fantasy. And they then use that as a base to think about the sea and think about, well, this is the edge of the land. And oddly enough, according to the painting, the scratches on the wall, you can see that effectively the first seafood early man ever ate 170 odd thousand years ago was an oyster, which when you think about it, you know, that old adage, it's a brave man who ate the first oyster. Well, they were indeed very brave. Not only had they walked all the way from the Olduvai Gorge, but they were now sampling a food which clearly doesn't to most people look initially like a foodstuff. So yes, I mean, what you say about territorial comfort is absolutely true. But there were those who were curious, and they left their comfort zone, to employ something of a cliche, but mercifully they did. Although then you think about Pascal's famous remark about all of human misery and problems derived from his pathological inability to remain comfortable in his own living room. And of course, that's very true. Why the need to travel? Because once we start traveling, we create problems. So it's a fantastically interesting subject, I think.
Well, and the other interesting part of land, of course, is going back to cartography, is the mapping. And one of the interesting points, many of the interesting points you make on the detailed look that you take at the history of mapping, which you've of course addressed before, is the political, and this is something I'm very interested in, that people felt the urge to draw up maps, not just to create boundaries, but to reorder the world, as the world shifted and changed in terms of, and as power dynamics became much more important in the relationship between different territories, mapping became of critical importance. And you pointed to the end of the First World War as a sort of a great watershed of mapping activity, because of course that's when the great powers had to reorder themselves.
I find one of the most fascinating and poignant stories was this attempt by politically disinterested geographers in the 1870s and 1880s to come up with a scheme to map the entire planet at the same scale, 1 to 1,000,000, and using the same typeface, the same tints, the same system of mapping, and to make each map, which would be about, well, I can't really demonstrate on this, but about arm widths across in size, have the kind of projection that if you sellotape them all together, you would produce a globe 1/1,000,000th the size of the planet. So this, as you rightly point out, this effort really began around the time of the First World War. It was, of course, came to a halt during the war. Energy was rekindled. And to make it sort of politically neutral, the International Institute of Geographers arranged that countries would never map themselves, or indeed their near neighbors. But you had things like the Japanese would map Brazil, or the Americans would map China, or the British would map Bolivia, something like that, where there is no sort of imperial dynamic involved in it. And slowly this aggregation of maps increased and increased and increased. To cover the whole planet, at least the land surface, would take about 850 sheets, 2,000 for everything, but that includes an awful lot of ocean. So it proceeded, and by the time of the Second World War, about 400 sheets had been finished. Beautiful, beautiful things. Then the Second World War interrupted things again. Then more energy was pumped into the project, more and more sheets, until ultimately the energy of the world began to focus on other things, in cartographic energy. And we came to a situation in about 1985 in Bangkok, not far away from you are today, where the United Nations, who was now superintending the project, had a meeting. What are we going to do about this map project? We've produced 800 sheets. We're only 50 shy of finishing them. We're not going to finish them. And so the project was abandoned. So I was just going to say, as a coder, for years I've been looking for a complete set of the maps, and most of them have disappeared. I ultimately found them completely coincidentally in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin. There's a map library there which has in these beautiful cabinets every single one of the existing maps. And to someone like you and me, they're a joy to behold because they're so beautiful. And you curse the day the UN ended the project.
And when I was reading that, I was thinking to myself, in 1969, the Americans landed on the moon, and they already had a photographic capture of the surface of the Earth. And of course, satellites had been doing this already. And so this project to map the Earth using this complicated land-based survey continued while there was already the technology to see the world from afar.
Yes.
And it struck me as just odd that this just continued.
And the wonderfully sort of Victorian image continuing, as you say, into the 1960s and 70s with men with chains and building theodolite towers. It's so antiquated. I mean, the stories, which you'll be very familiar with, the great triangulation of India, for instance, were done by Sir George Everest, reminding us that Mount Everest should actually be pronounced Mount Everest. And the triangulation, which I write about in some detail, of what's called the Struve geodetic arc, stretching from Hammerfest in Norway to Odessa on the Black Sea, simply because we needed to know the size of the Earth, of the planet, how big it was. So these magnificent projects, like great dictionaries and encyclopedias, fascinating, but unfortunately no longer relevant in the digital, satellite-oriented electronic world. So sad.
Somewhat less benignly, though, of course, at the time when people were figuring out how to draw these maps, some of the lines that were drawn across the great continent of Africa, across the Middle East, and of course the famous partition of India, were had huge human consequences. I mean, you go into some detail, and I actually went to watch that film that you mentioned by the Indian director, This Bloody Line, about the partition of India, about the rather sort of mild-mannered Welshman who, or I think he was Welsh, Radcliffe, who drew the line. It's a great story, and it's a tragic story, of course.
So tragic. I mean, this man, plucked by Mountbatten out of essential obscurity, he'd never been east of Paris. And Mountbatten called and said, "Do us a favor, old boy, partition India. Will you draw a line on the west side and on the eastern side to create these two new states of West and East Pakistan, which later became Pakistan and contemporary Bangladesh." And so this man, with a staff of judges, moved into Simla, up in the foothills of the Himalayas, and with not particularly good maps, with his fountain pen, drew a line which became the frontier between, most notably, between India and today's Pakistan. And of course, the consequence of it, when finally it was finished and India and Pakistan were declared to be independent of British rule, was that millions of people moved to get into their comfort zones that you were talking about earlier. So millions, hundreds of thousands, millions, I think, of Muslims living in India moved west to go into to Pakistan, and hundreds, thousands of Hindus and Sikhs moved eastward to get to Amritsar and Delhi and their comfort zone. And in the process, there was this endless orgy of killing, which the British briefly, who had no longer any authority, tried to maintain some order. The Indian army was at the time hopeless, and so untold millions were killed, to the great distress of this mild-mannered Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who decided he wouldn't take the money, the modest sum. I think he'd been offered £5,000 to do this, and he burned all his notes and returned to India a broken and tragic figure.
To England.
To England, I mean, yes, and forgotten almost by all, except oddly enough by W.H. Auden, who wrote a poignant poem about this man caught up in this nexus of partition and horror. It is, you're right, a very sad, poignant and good story.
Even pointing out that during the time he was drawing the line, he suffered from dysentery, the trots.
I know, some of the trots, yes, quite.
I mean, I'd like to pursue the line drawing a bit because, because of the impact that this had on in terms of human suffering. And what is it about the British, for instance, that just compelled them to partition things, and not the French as well? I mean, there was this kind of European desire to divide when they saw diversity. I mean, unlike the Ottomans and unlike even pre-colonial India or, much of Southeast Asia, when they saw diversity, they decided the best thing to do was to divide, either geographically or socially, communally. I mean, Jerusalem, for instance, was partitioned by Edward Allenby on the basis that when he arrived in 1917, well, of course, the Christians have to live in one quarter, the Muslims have to live in another, and so what compelled these people thinking of space and people to put them in different places rather than, I mean, logic would suggest that to have them mixing would prevent them from, would actually encourage a bit more harmony in the end. Even if you looking at diversity from their perspective, I suppose they thought, well, it might be trouble for us. But why do you think there was this compulsion to partition?
Well, I suppose it goes back to sort of the bureaucratic mind of filing things neatly. And I have, it's in my map cabinet, which is to the left of me now, the map that I, as a reporter, used to carry with me at all times, issued by the British Army in Northern Ireland. I was there from 69 to 72, the beginning of the Troubles, which was called, I mean, it says at the top, Belfast Tribal Map. And it shows it's a street map of Belfast with green and orange places in which the Catholics and the Protestants lived. And where the green and orange met was a nightly scene of mayhem and chaos and ultimately terrorism. And they had to build a wall, first of all, barbed wire, and then a wall which still exists today in 2020, the Peace Wall. And that, of course, is expanded beyond simply Belfast, but now between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And as you rightly say, the, quote, peace wall around the West Bank in contemporary Israel, all deriving from something that, as you say, the Ottomans didn't do to at least the great extent of file people away. So put all the Catholics there, put all the Protestants there, put all the Arabs there, put all the Jews here. And it makes for a mess. I mean, look at Ceylon, Sri Lanka. The indentured workers that were brought to harvest from southern India, the Tamils, were effectively restricted to the north of this wonderful pear-shaped island, and the Buddhists in the south. No one thought at the time this was being done that it would lead to chaos. I suppose the classic thing to watch is that wonderful Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie sketch on the Treaty of Westphalia, which was they've all dressed up in their 17th century kit. And they're talking about how to partition Europe, dealing particularly with the future of Luxembourg. I wish we could see it now, because you've got Stephen Fry. I don't know who owns Luxembourg. I thought you did the French. No, it must be Belgian. No, let's use it for storage. And eventually someone said, well, how about we divide Luxembourg, have the Catholics on one side and the Protestants on the other? And someone says, well, no, that'll lead to trouble. And Stephen Fry says, well, no, it'll give something for journalists to write about in the future. I'm perfectly content with that. But it is a British phenomenon. You're absolutely right.
It is. And I think, it probably boils down to ease of control and the whole issue of, divide and rule. But then, you go on to also celebrate maps, not so much as a device of control, but an instrument of freedom. And, you and I grew up in England, and so we're aware of this, but the whole Ordnance Survey map, which you describe as for the ordinary Briton, providing access to a relationship with a land and a degree of freedom. I love that because I can completely relate to that. They're not just all about constraint. They're also about providing access to land and showing people the way, I suppose, to enjoy that land, right?
Well, absolutely. And it is, to both you and me, I'm sure, instructive that Americans are hopeless. I mean, I live in America, I live in Massachusetts, but they have no interest at all in maps. They have a mapping agency, which is superb, the US Geological Survey, and you can get very, very detailed maps, as indeed I have. They are hopeless at reading maps. They wouldn't know which way is up. Whereas we at school, we learned how to read. I mean,
with compass.
Conventional signs, church with steeple, church with post office, all that sort of stuff.
But
I'm sorry.
In America, isn't it really a product? I mean, there's two things that everyone drives everywhere. So it's all about which highway you're on. So it's the I-95 or the whatever. And so therefore the land beyond the roads is maybe not so important because they're driving long distances. But the other thing that strikes me is in England, no one has a sense of direction unless they have a compass and a map. But in America, people will say, so go north and then go south and then go east. And I'm going, but I don't know which way is north or south or east. And New York is classic. They will always tell you, well, just go south on this and then go left. Instead of going left, go east. And I'm going, how do I know?
Quite right. I mean, they also have this other thing. I don't mean to spend the entire program deriding Americans, but they, easy to do though. You talk about distance, and everything is to do with time. How far away am I from New York? 2 hours and a quarter, not 133 miles. So they have, everything relates to at 55 miles an hour, speed limit, and on the state roads here anyway, how long does it take to get somewhere, rather than where is it? Interestingly enough, I at the end of the book, I have this, I sort of retell the Tolstoy story about how much land does one man need. And the interesting thing about that story, which works on all sorts of levels, is that the people from whom Tolstoy at the end of the story buys land sell it not according to the acreage, but according to, it's 1,000 rubles a day. He said, what do you mean? How do you sell land by the day? Well, it's the amount of land you can walk around in a day will cost you 1,000 rubles. This weird concept, which I won't spoil the story by telling you how it ends. It's extremely poignant and makes an important point for the structure of this book. But it is odd, in the same way that Americans know nothing about distance in terms of linearity, but in terms of time. Similarly, in rural Russia, it tended to be not in aerial measurement, but in temporal measurement.
Yeah, and there's another aspect of this which I very much enjoyed was the whole issue of ownership. And there's one very lovely, beautiful description of, and we've all seen the movies of the great, discovery of the West and the homesteading that went on. But you described that wonderful process by which people staked out their land physically. And there's a sort of sense of euphoria. People who had nothing, who then suddenly have 160 acres of land just because they got there first. And I suppose that's not just about land, that's also tells you a lot about society in America, that, this concept of, the freedom of ownership and the freedom of existence. And that somehow today becomes very relevant, Simon, because of course, a lot of our societies now are beginning to question this balance between, rights and responsibility, and especially in the pandemic. I think that it's clear that the great resistance that people have, and it's not so much related to land, but it stems from, in a way, the origin of the United States, that the resistance people have to compliance and to sort of following orders, because no, we are free and we've staked out, we have our stake in this land, and therefore we have a right to do what we want. But yet that could be a life-threatening, a culture, as we've seen.
I tell you, what you've said in the last paragraph, deserves so much unpacking. First of all, the sheer romantic thought, 22nd of April, 1889, you've got this huge tract of unclaimed land in the middle of the state that is going to become Oklahoma. To say why it's unclaimed leads you into another direction, which is it was assigned to Indians who had been forcibly moved to western, northern, eastern Oklahoma. And that's a story full of tragedy on its own. But in the middle was this 2.5 million acres that hadn't been assigned. And so the US government thought, well, there are lots of people, white people, it has to be said, largely white people, who have come from all over the world, and they're going to be given this land effectively. So 22nd of April, ladies and gentlemen, line up on your horses or with your Conestoga wagons or on foot, and you'll be prevented from moving until midday by soldiers, US cavalrymen. But at 12 o'clock, they'll blow their bugles or fire their guns in the air, and you can ride hell for leather over these endless expanses of prairie and leap from your horse where you think you'd like to do so, plant in a flag, and as long as you pay a $5 fee to register it, that land is yours, 160 acres, or if very generous, an entire section, 640 acres. Can you imagine if you're from, I don't know, poverty in a shtetl in Russia or Poland, or if you've come from Ireland, you know, blighted by the potato famine, all of a sudden, under the sunshine of an April day in Oklahoma, I mean, one can get very romantic and teary-eyed about this. There are hills and streams and grassland, and that land belongs to you. You can do, as you say, anything you want with it.
And it's formative. It's formative. It becomes part of the national character.
Totally, absolutely. So hugely important in the foundation of the United States, because I mean, we haven't even discussed the whole business of clearances or of enclosure, which is clearly a British or a Scottish phenomenon, which led a lot of people to leave the land and seek their fortunes elsewhere. But in America, where founding fathers, people like Thomas Jefferson, said if only this was a country where everyone was a yeoman farmer and owned a little land and improved it, and that's the crucial thing. You can own this land if you improve it. Which brings me, and if you think I'm rambling, do shut me up, but the idea of land that had never belonged to anyone in Holland, raised from the sea. The government says to the Dutch people, all right, we've got 100,000 acres of virgin land. There's no problem about anyone. You're not stealing it from anyone because it was never owned by anybody. Go to it. You can own this land so long as once you've settled on it, you improve it. And that's part of the responsibility you're talking about, to make it better. And of course, an awful lot of landowners do anything but, and they ruin it and despoil it and pollute it.
Well, you give a wonderful vignette about Gina Reinhardt in Australia, who probably owns more land than almost anyone else. I think you mentioned the size of England, and the attitude that then engenders towards the rest of the world. But I'd like to come back to what I said earlier, which is okay. So this is not just about ownership. It actually has formed human societies, and I think it's related. I'd like to relate it rather to what we have in this part of the world, in Asia, where different societies have, of course, evolved over the years, different forms of land ownership, and there's a lot more collectivity, and there's a lot more sharing of land. Of course, land is a bit scarce in Southeast Asia because there are lots of hills, and then you're dependent on valleys that are fed by rivers, and rice cultivation is very intensive. But I sense that in this part of the world, there is a sort of, you're living much more closely together. And yes, there's land ownership. The parcels are somewhat smaller. The scale is smaller. And the labor that's used on that land is often shared. And it's, of course, helped develop societies that are very much more, where people are very much more dependent on one another, even if they own the land. And I wonder if that's also helped it's been formative in terms of society, where, again, that emphasis on responsibility becomes much greater rather than rights. I mean, it's complicated by the fact that not everyone had many rights in this part of the world anyway, but nonetheless, responsibility was associated with the land because you had to share the utilization of that land to a much greater degree.
You're absolutely right. And I mean, I write about this mostly in a North American context. The Native Americans owned their land collectively. Chief Sealth, whose name was used to give the name of Seattle today, made this speech in the 1870s when he had been compelled to give his land away to white settlers. He said, you're going to own it? I mean, you can't own the air. You can't own the ocean. You can't own the earth. We own it together. It is our mother. Treat it well, and it will treat you well. So don't own it and divide it into parcels and compete with each other. No, own it jointly and severally. Similarly, the Aboriginal people in Australia the Maoris in New Zealand, until the British came in 1840 and the Treaty of Waitangi was signed. The idea of private ownership was completely alien. And slowly, this idea of communal ownership is, I think, seeping back into some quarters here of where I live. I mean, in Massachusetts, which is a pretty liberal, politically liberal state, we'll see how liberal in a little while, there is a move for land my land. I've got some land here, but I've now given it back to the people, the community. I can use it. I have sort of exclusive use of it, if you like, but I have no trespassing signs. People can come and camp and walk and do what they like. That is an increasing phenomenon, but only in the northeast of the United States. The big landowners, like Gina Reinhardt in Australia, but like Ted Turner, who founded CNN, John Malone, who is another big television person, and these awful people called the Wilkes brothers, who own hundreds of thousands of acres. They're evangelical Christians from West Texas who believe God gave them the right. They made their money from fracking, I might say. Pretty disagreeable way of earning money. And now they've put all their profits, which, oddly enough, their company was bought by a Singapore sovereign wealth fund, giving them an unbelievable amount of money, which they now use to buy huge tracts in Montana and Idaho and Wyoming, from which they restrict people. So this goes into I know I'm burbling on quite a lot, but the whole idea of access to land, irrespective of who actually owns it, who should be allowed to be on it. Well, in America, trespass laws are very fierce. And if the Wilkes brothers say, you can't go on our land, then the law says, okay, well, we'll send the police to turf people off. But in Sweden, say, there is this philosophy called allemansrätten, which means all people are allowed to have access to all land, no matter who owns it. And that seems to me to be a pretty decent compromise, that you can own 1,000 acres, but anyone can walk on it, camp on it, fish on it, do what they like, because it really is to be shared by all.
I mean, you've been extremely prolific, writing a lot of books, Simon, about very important, but also sometimes rather mundane things. But I sense in this book, because you began it with your own personal, you made reference to your land, and also because of your background as a geographer, I felt there was a lot of emotion in this book, which came across. You were passionate about this. I mean, of course, to write a book of this length on any subject, you have to be reasonably passionate. But I felt that in this case, there was a lot of passion, and which is what I think drove me through it, rather than just the facts themselves, interesting though they may be. And I wonder if you reflect back on some of the other things that you've looked at, whether it was the Oxford English Dictionary, you mentioned the Atlantic, whether it was Krakatoa in Indonesia. Do you feel that you've sort of put more passion into this, that this was something rather special as a subject, but also because you made it quite personal?
I think so. I don't think I initially set out to write an impassioned book. I mean, to me, and I mentioned this, I stand on the shoulders of one particular great writer who I never met, but his brother was my boss a long time ago, a chap called Andrew Linklater, who wrote a book not very long ago called Owning the Earth, which was a definitive academic in tone and somewhat dry, whereupon at 65 years old, Andrew died very tragically. So that book is this subject, but written in all I did, and I freely admit it, is that I took this subject and added to it my own personal feeling about the precious nature of the land and tract in New York State, in Dutchess County, and feel an astonishing sense of, well, it's a conflicting set of feelings. Cherish it. I mean, it is not a particularly spectacular piece of land, but to fall to one's knees and to realize that the earth under your knees and the rocks beside you and the streams and the trees and the plants all, quote, belong to me. What does that mean? And I think that question animates the whole of this book. And I believe passionately that land should not be owned exclusively by individual people. It should be owned by us all. And I think that if it comes across as passion, then so be it. And whether it brings about in any small degree some reform, well, I am somewhat optimistic because, as I mentioned earlier, it clearly is happening here in the northeast of the United States. But there are still, we're beating against the tide of people like Gina Reinhardt and John Malone and the Wilkes brothers, who do the very reverse of what I think ought to be done.
Well, I mean, I think that's a very nice way of putting it. But increasing numbers of us, of course, are no longer living on land. We're living on strata title. We're living at elevations. We're escaping rising sea levels. We're receding from the land in many ways. And, so I think also many of us will read the book with a certain amount of, yearning for the past, a nostalgia even, for the fact that maybe our parents owned land, but we no longer own land.
Well,
and yes.
And an interesting aspect of this is, and I use it as the epigraph for the book, is that initially I quoted from Gone with the Wind, when Gerard O'Hara sees his daughter Scarlett moping around because of her ruined love affair, and she's going to leave. And he says, no, don't leave, Tara, the house. Land is the only thing worth working for, the only thing worth fighting for, the only thing worth dying for, because land is the only thing that lasts. Well, of course, it's now not true. As people in Kiribati and so forth, Bangladesh, now realize because of rising sea levels, land, which has hitherto always been regarded as absolutely unassailable and permanent, no longer is. It's being chewed away. And in the finished version of the book, there's some remarkable photographs of land being destroyed in North Carolina, particularly by the ever-encroaching and rising sea. So it's not the absolutely copper-bottomed asset it once was. It's an asset which is diminishing. So as I say, at the end of this little epigraph, taken from that famous book, The Go-Between, the future is a different country. They will do things differently there.
And the future may be more fluid. I think of, think of the sea gypsies, the Bajau, who live on boats. And I remember that, I forget the name of the film that Kevin Costner made about a future dystopian world where everyone lives on rafts.
Yes, that was an expensive mistake, that film, right?
But so, I mean...
Waterworld, I think it's called.
Yeah, that's right. But before we get to the end of this, I mean, there are a couple of questions I've always been dying to ask you, because, we were both geographers and shared a discipline. We also shared a profession as journalists. And you've been so prolific as a writer that I always feel you've sort of abandoned journalism, perhaps because you can write at such speed and produce so many books. You don't feel that you need to. And I wonder about the balance between, writing a book, which is a process and then is a very gratifying outcome, and yet the ability to sort of continue to say things from the bully pulpit of journalism. Do you miss that?
Well, let me tell you, I live in this little village called Sandisfield, named after Lord Sands, who was the colonial treasurer in Britain in the early 17th century, late 17th century. Sandisfield has a population of 850, and it's divided by 2 rivers into 3 valleys. So there's very little sense of community. And I've lived here now for 19 years. Well, 11 years ago, I said, to bring this community together, we need a newspaper. And so my wife and I started one. And the Sandusfield Times, reliable, regular, and relevant, comes out every month. It's free, and it was initially derided by the community. Now everyone looks forward to it. We've got a meeting actually in a couple of days to discuss the board and how it's all going. They give us money, the population, we've got money in the bank. And this is a free newspaper, although it circulates by mail. We've got a reader in Tasmania, of all places. So I write journalism. I've got a tiny little bully pulpit for a tiny audience. But the power of ultra-local journalism is very important.
And maybe greater. And maybe greater these days.
That's exactly the point, Michael, yes. And so I'm really proud. I'm writing a story this month on the broken cap in the garbage dump that is going to cost the town a great deal of money to remediate, to use an American word, all the garbage that is leaking from this underground tank. I'm writing about some orgy of house burning on Lower West Street. So I do journalism. And believe you me, coming down from the pomposity and the heights of writing big fat books to writing about ordinary people for a tiny little newspaper gives me huge pleasure. So I do still practice journalism, but a somewhat diminished.
I'm very pleased to hear that. I mean, I reflect on, but these are important times, and I mean, they are turbulent times, and in the sense that for people, of your generation, the successive generation, and I look at my children, for instance, there are times that are hard to understand and interpret, and yet the world of journalism has become increasingly beset by, and I will not use the FN word, the fake news word. I don't believe in using that, but have been beset by the problems of conveying information accurately and effectively and reliably, and hence the title of the subhead in your newspaper, reliable. Was it reliable?
Regular, relevant, and reliable.
And reliable. Well, this is exactly what afflicts the media today. It's kind of irregular because you never know. Well, it can be regular, it may be because of social media. It's not reliable, and it's not all that relevant. So I feel that somehow, those of us who are able to still try to do that are becoming extremely valuable. So you've covered all these great big issues and small issues, but I'd like to sort of ask you, if it's not too presumptuous, so where do you go next? Land, you've done sea, you've kind of done air, and you've certainly done a lot of geographical topics. What do you think would interest you next?
Well, I sort of know, because I'm in the middle of writing the proposal for it, and I know the publishers seem to want it, and it goes exactly to what you've just been saying. It's a book that I think I'm going to call it, at least this is the working title, how they fall like ninepins, but anyway, the current working title is Knowing What We Know, and it's a history of the dissemination of knowledge. So it starts off with a room in Cambridge on Sylvester Road. You go into this room, and the thing that you're told to look for is that in the floor of the room there is cut a hole with a glass window beneath which is flowing a stream. It's the only way the planning permission could be granted for building this building. And people look at the stream and say, oh, isn't that amusing, and leave. What they don't notice is what's on the shelves around the wall, which is every single volume of the longest encyclopedia ever made, the Siku Kwangshu, which was organized by the Emperor Qianlong in 1782, which was an amassment in 36,000 volumes of all the knowledge in the world gathered together in one place. There was no mention of Newton or Galileo or Shakespeare, but nonetheless, that was what in Beijing was believed to be all the knowledge in the world, which reminds one of the probably apocryphal Confucian exam question, which until the 8th or 9th century, there was only one question, which was write down everything you know. Which
Well, you've written
somewhat
about
daunting.
You've written
So
about,
this looks at, I beg your pardon, sorry.
no, I mean, and you did an interesting book on Joseph Needham and the man who loved China, and you know, I often think that it's a very good point that you make about knowledge and China, and it's particularly relevant today. And there's my favorite book on China is by Maurice Collis, and it's called The Great Within. I don't know if you've read that, but it's about,
I have it.
yeah, and it's about
yes.
every single foreigner who tried to penetrate the Forbidden City. And there is this great sense in which they had no need for the foreigners. They had no need for what the Jesuits brought, for what the Dutch were peddling, and then eventually the English privateers. And yet that's such a relevant question today, because they're now the second largest power in the world, the second largest economy in the world. And of course, people now look darkly upon the prospect of Chinese influence around the world. And yet, as you say, you know, they have this long, long history of not being particularly interested in the world.
No, I mean, the celebrated moment when Lord Macartney was compelled to kowtow in front of the same emperor, Qianlong, and they brought all these gifts like Waterford crystal. And the emperor said, oh, we make much better crystal than this. Why have you brought this rubbish? And many of the packages were never opened and reside to this day unopened in the Palace Museum in Taipei. So yes, the disdain the Chinese have for the rest of us, we barbarians, long-nosed, and we smell terrible like old wet dogs and milk and things that they find disagreeable. No, they put us in our place, and I'm fascinated by that. But this book, I think, as I say, I'm in the middle of writing the proposal, will go sort of beyond just looking at China's sort of dominance in this particular aspect of it, but we'll look at going from cave paintings to Wikipedia, for instance. But we'll look at teaching. I mean, when do children amass most knowledge? Apparently at 5 years old, they're like sponges and all the knowledge pours into their brains. And then again at 11. And the difference between information and knowledge, that a child at 5 can say, that is a dog. But it takes until 11 before he can answer the question, what is a dog? And that's the difference between information and knowledge. So this is a wonderful topic. I'm really so excited and looking forward to getting into it.
It's bigger than land.
Much bigger than land, yes.
Well, Simon, this has been a wonderfully interesting conversation for me. I hope for everyone who watches.
Oh, it has for me too.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to knowledge and knowledge explained. there's a nice knowledge explained. There you go.
Why not?
Title. Voila. I just have to, before we close, I have to then thank the organizers of Kembali 20 and say that Kembali 20 was made possible with the support of the Yayasan Mudra Swari Saraswati patron program and their donors. The patron program was created to seek assistance for the survival of both festivals and the foundation. By making a valuable contribution to the Yayasan patron program, you will be directly involved in delivering both festivals in due time. Your contribution will guarantee the future of Indonesia's most meaningful cross-cultural platform of words, ideas, culture, and the creative arts. We all look forward to coming back to Ubud, I'm sure, once travel resumes. Follow at Ubud Writers Festival on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, or visit ubudwritersfestival.com for more information about the patron program. Simon, thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure. I hope I can see you again soon, someday, around the traps, and look forward to reading Knowledge Explained.
Great, that'll be the title. Michael, thank you very much. This has been stimulating, interesting, and thank you very much indeed. Bless
Thank you, Simon. All right, bye-bye.